press was at least as important as government. So the case that you're making today, Mr. Leader, is well stated.
Let me thank the senator from Oregon for his leadership. Thank you.
Madam President, in a few minutes, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to pass my bipartisan bill, the Press Act. And this legislation, Madam President, is deeply personal to me. I'm very proud to be the son of Peter Wyden, who was an award-winning journalist. My dad fled the Nazis in the 1930s, and members of his family died at the hands of the Nazis. In the United States, my dad became such a good writer, he became part of our Army's elite group, the Ritchie Boys, that wrote the propaganda pamphlets that we dropped on the Nazis. Growing up, my dad always mentioned that several of our founding fathers, as I indicated to the majority leader here, stressed how important the free press was to our country. And my dad emphasized how important it is that American journalists can do their jobs without unneeded government interference. So our bipartisan bill shields journalists from being forced by the courts to disclose their sources or information provided by their sources with, as the majority leader and I have emphasized, key exceptions exist in our legislation for national security and other critical matters. And our bill also does not otherwise limit the government's ability to pursue leakers. So this is so common sense, Madam President, that nearly every state in the country has some form of reporter's shield on the books. Democratic and Republican state legislators alike have found value in preserving the free flow of information and codifying these fundamental freedoms. My bill with Senator Lee, and I want to thank our colleague on the other side of the aisle on all his good counsel here, our bill would finally ensure that these protections make it to the federal level. This is a bill, and I note this, my colleague, the President of the Senate, knows that sometimes it's pretty hard around the Congress to be able to get folks to agree to order a 7-Up or something. This bill passed this House unanimously and has the support of both the chair of the Judiciary Committee and ranking member, Senator Graham. Not only that, but our bill has been endorsed by people from across the political spectrum. I'd say to my friend from Nevada, Tucker Carlson is on board. Fox News is on board. This is about as bipartisan as you can get. Past administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have exploited the lack of a federal shield law to curtail the freedom of the press and in some cases even jailed journalists who refused to break their journalistic ethics and reveal their sources. It is long overdue that these abuses be stopped. So my substitute amendment that I put together with Senator Lee addresses feedback that we heard on this Senate floor and elsewhere. My colleague from Arkansas, member of the Intelligence Committee, spoke about this before, and we heard feedback from the Department of Justice that they wanted some key national security exceptions for Section 702 and threats to critical infrastructure and ensuring that the federal government can still respond to cases that require exigency. So I want it understood that between the time this came up on the floor previously and today, we have reached out for feedback that addresses a number of the concerns that I heard from my colleague from Arkansas, a member on the Intelligence Committee that I work with, that I hope addresses his concerns. So, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on the Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4250 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the Wyden substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Madam President,
Senator from Arkansas.
reserving the right to object, this bill is a threat to U.S. national security and an insult to basic fairness and the principle of equality before the law. This is the biggest giveaway to the liberal press in American history. The so-called Press Act would turn reporters into a protected class, free to hold, share, and publish highly classified and dangerous information that no other American is allowed to possess. Passage of this bill would turn the United States Senate into the active accomplice of deep state leakers, traitors, and criminals, along with the America-hating and fame-hungry journalists who helped them out. This legislation would make it all but impossible to ever compel a reporter to reveal their sources or compel them to return classified information in their possession. Reporters would become the only class of people legally permitted to possess classified information in an unsecure and unmonitored environment. It gives reporters rights that no other American possesses. No senator even has these protections. In fact, if the senator from Oregon was given unsecured classified information and refused to turn it over, he could be censored, prosecuted, and possibly even put in jail. And we wouldn't want that to happen. We would miss him dearly. Even former presidents don't have the rights that this legislation provides to liberal journalists. Just remember, the FBI raided President Trump's house on the mere accusation that he held unsecured classified information. And unlike President Trump, President Biden actually committed this crime and only escaped prosecution because the prosecutor concluded he was too addled to be convicted. Thanks to this bill, reporters at CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times would have more rights and privileges than former presidents and vice presidents. This bill would also embolden every leaker and would-be traitor in the federal government within arm's reach of classified or damaging information. Leakers could reveal anything from the placement of American troops in foreign countries to the location of nuclear weapons with only the thinnest and hardest to prove exceptions. They could release embarrassing or incriminating information from FBI background checks. They could also release information provided by allied nations, endangering America's alliances around the world. If this bill became law, every leaker would sleep well at night knowing that their accomplices in the media would never have to turn them in. Leakers could also release, say, phone records of discussions between the President of the United States and foreign leaders. And this bill would protect any reporter who released or possessed the contents of those calls. Maybe it should be called the Alexander Vindman Protection Act. Not surprisingly, President Trump recently wrote, "Republicans must kill this bill." And for the benefit of those who missed it, he wrote it in all capital letters and with an exclamation point at the end. So please type that into the record as well. The bill's advocates often say, too much stuff is classified. I agree. On the Intelligence Committee, I often ask, why is this classified? But some information ought to be classified. And the solution to overclassification is to classify less stuff, not to enable liberal deep staters to leak to liberal journalists. Another argument I hear is government employees often violate the law and abuse our citizens. I agree, especially when Democrats are in office. But whistleblowers have plenty of legal and effective avenues to raise those concerns. If their superiors refuse to listen to them, they can contact their department's inspector general or ombudsman. They can also contact congressional oversight committees or federal law enforcement. What they shouldn't do, what the law in fact forbids them from doing, is running off to the liberal media. And even with its present protections, which I think are excessive, the liberal media has a long record of endangering our troops and our interests around the world. The liberal media doesn't deserve more privileges, protections, and perks. Releasing classified information is a serious crime, and it should be punished seriously. And contrary to what members of the press may think, a press badge doesn't make you better than the rest of America or put you above the law. For several years, the media has conducted itself in a disgraceful manner and destroyed its reputation with the American people. Yet some in Congress, maybe the only institution less popular than the press, now want to give it more privileges? I don't think so. My message is simple. No one is entitled to the privileges provided in this bill, certainly not the press. Therefore, I object.
Objection is heard.
Just to
Senator
be-
from Oregon.
Be brief here. This legislation that we have been discussing passed the House of Representatives early this year, and it was unanimous. So for people who are following the debate, every single Republican, every one in the other body, in effect, approved this legislation. Why did they do that? Because it clearly is sensitive to these national security concerns. We put in express exceptions for national security, including an area my colleague and I know a lot about, Section 702 of FISA. So my colleague was very kind to me. He said, gosh, if I wasn't here, he'd miss me. Well, that's very kind and thoughtful, but what we're really missing is the overwhelming support from Republicans for this legislation. I spoke about the members in the other body. No one else is objecting, here. And I just think that if we look at the writings of the Founding Fathers and their importance of a free press, what we ought to be saying is, yes, we should be listening to each other. That's why I made those changes since the last time my colleague from Arkansas objected. This is going to also, and I think my colleague and I would agree on this, protect citizens, journalists who don't have the legal budget to fight subpoenas the way big newspapers can. That's why my bill has been endorsed by independent journalists like Catherine Herridge. So I understand that we don't have unanimous consent today. I think it's unfortunate. I think America would be stronger and freer if we were passing this legislation today. But we'll be back, and my hope is that we can work with the senator from Arkansas to get his support. And I want it understood from the standpoint of good faith that I listened the last time my colleague and I were here on the floor of the United States Senate, and I thought he made good arguments. I'm not here to say he is without good arguments. And that's why I went out and I told our staff and all the folks on the Intel Committee and the people who work with us on it, make these changes to see if we can come aboard. So I realize we don't have unanimous consent this afternoon, but I just say to my colleagues, this is about as important as it gets. Free speech is fundamental to what makes our country so special. I've had more than 1,100 town hall meetings at home, and people always come and say, I don't agree with you about this, or I don't agree with you about that, but we're using our First Amendment. We're making sure we can always be heard. So I will tell my colleague, my door is open, and we'll be talking to your folks to see if we can get this resolved. And as I say, I made those changes since the last time we were on the floor for the express purpose of our being able to see if we could find agreement. So, Madam President, I respect my colleagues' right to dissent in spite of the fact that every single House Republican voted for it, and I'm going to be coming back and seeing if we can find ways to work it out, and I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from Arkansas.
I appreciate the remarks of the senator from Oregon. The Founding Fathers designed the Senate to be the sober second thought to the House of Representatives or even transient and fleeting public opinion. The senator from Oregon cited a unanimous vote in the House. Sometimes that's an indication of widespread support for a sound and wise policy. But on occasion, it's an indication that a rash, impetuous, hasty, impulsive decision by the House deserves a sober second thought in the United States Senate. And not for the first time, I'm pleased to provide the sober second thought on this and other issues. I yield the floor.